took a direct hit!
At 11:47 in the morning on a late May day in 1943, engines rumbled across the hard stand at Alconbury as ground crews rushed to finish their checks. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. Clouds drifted low, casting long shadows over rows of flying fortresses, preparing to climb toward occupied Europe. Captain James Hartwell stepped into the cockpit of a machine that felt both familiar and foreign. It had the bones of a B-17, but the nose no longer held a bombardier's table. Instead, a new turret faced forward like a clenched jaw, ready to meet the first strike. This was the YB-40, the flying destroyer, born from a desperate idea. In the months before this morning, American bomber crews had flown into a gauntlet from which far too many never returned. Enemy fighters waited for the moment when the formations lightened after the bomb drop, when the fastest bombers pulled away and the heaviest fell behind. That was when the killing began. The YB-40 promised to stand in that gap, to guard the wounded edge of the formation with fire instead of speed. What happened next would test not just a new design, but the belief that one heavily armed bomber could shield many. Did such a gamble ever stand a chance above enemy territory? But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to WW2 Secret Archives and leave a comment about which country you're watching the video from. Dawn came slowly over the English countryside in the spring of 1943, revealing long rows of flying fortresses lined up wingtip to wingtip. Each aircraft carried the weight of a strategy that had been pushed to its breaking point. The 8th Air Force believed in daylight precision bombing, a doctrine built on the promise that disciplined formations, steady northern sights, and determined crews could cut deep into the German war machine. But belief alone could not hold a formation together when enemy fighters poured into the sky by the dozens. The problem began long before the first bombs fell. Bomber crews took off heavy with fuel, ammunition, and hope that the fighters escorting them would remain long enough to see them home. Yet every mile carried them farther from protection. The available American fighters could not reach the industrial heart of the Reich. Their fuel ran thin over Belgium, and their pilots had to turn back even as the bombers pressed farther east. From that moment onward, the fortresses were alone, climbing into the range of seasoned German pilots who knew exactly when to strike. By the winter before Hartwell's mission, the pattern had become a grim equation. On the way to the target, the formations held. Gunners shouted bearings, watched contrails shift in the sun, felt the occasional thump of flak against steel. But the real danger waited for the return leg. When the bomb bays opened, the loads dropped, and the lightened aircraft surged ahead. Those that climbed faster survived. Those that could not were left behind in ones and twos, drifting into pockets of sky where radar stations and airfields seemed to coordinate in a silent hunt. The crews had a word for the stretch of sky between the target and the safety of the channel. They called it the gauntlet. Enemy fighters understood the weakness in the American strategy as well as the bombers did. Focke Wulf fighters attacked from the high 12 o'clock position, diving through the narrow gap where nose guns could not track quickly enough. Messerschmitt fighters followed from above and behind, exploiting the moment when a single fortress struggled to rejoin the group. Those stragglers rarely made it home. Reports listed their last known positions in brief sentences, sometimes only a coordinate and a timestamp. The truth was simple and devastating. Without escort fighters, the most disciplined formation could unravel in minutes. By the early months of 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost far more than anyone in Washington expected so early in the campaign. Line chiefs walked through empty parking bays where aircraft had stood only the morning before. Mess halls carried too many empty seats. Replacement crews arrived with wide eyes and nervous hands. Listening to veterans who counted missions like a dwindling currency, the rule said 25 meant a man could go home. Few believed they would reach that number. Pressure rose on engineers and commanders to find a solution that did not yet exist. Extending the range of escort fighters would take time, fuel innovations, and design changes still on drawing boards. Creating new tactics required testing conditions that could not be simulated on the ground. The need was immediate. Crews needed protection now, not in half a year. That urgency pushed minds toward an idea that seemed, at least at first glance, both logical and bold. If fighters could not stay with the bombers, perhaps a bomber could become the fighter. The proposal unfolded quickly. Take a B-17 airframe. Strip away everything that did not shoot. Remove the bombs. Reinforce the frame. Add armor where vulnerability was highest. Expand ammunition storage until the aircraft could sustain long bursts without pause. Replace the bombardier's glass nose with a turret pointing forward. Install a second upper turret behind the radio room. Move the waist position so gunners no longer collided during tight maneuvers. Add guns to the cheeks, to the sides, beneath the belly, above the spine. Create a flying wall of steel dense enough to make any enemy pilot reconsider his angle of attack. What emerged from this design was not a bomber at all, but a weapon built to stay with the wounded part of the formation, to fly deliberately with the slower aircraft, to absorb punishment so others could escape. The idea was simple. A formation protected at every angle might hold together long enough to cross the coastline. A single gunship at the tail might buy minutes, and those minutes might save hundreds of men. But beneath the optimism lay a truth that few wanted to confront. Every plate of armor, every ammunition bin, every steel support added weight, every additional turret added drag. The fortress, already a heavy machine, became heavier still. The cost of more guns was less speed, less climb, less ability to keep up once the others lightened their loads. The very advantage the flying destroyer needed to provide would depend on its ability to stay with the formation. And that ability was already in question before the first test flight. Engineers studied their calculations. Pilots reviewed early reports. Some raised concerns about balance and control. A few wondered whether the theory could survive the sky. But momentum carried the program forward. The 8th Air Force needed an answer, and the YB-40 was the only answer ready to fly. By the time the first aircraft arrived at Alconbury, mechanics gathered around them with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. The chin turret looked like a clenched steel jaw. The staggered waist position seemed to promise better coverage on both beams. Ammunition crates stacked high beside the machines caught the attention of every gunner who had ever run dry at the wrong moment. Even skeptics admitted the aircraft felt powerful, almost defiant. Some believed it was exactly what the formations needed. The stakes could not have been higher. If the YB-40 worked, it might change the survival rate of every future mission. If it failed, crews would continue flying into the same gauntlet that had claimed so many lives. The war in the air was becoming a contest of endurance, and endurance depended on protecting the men at the edges of the formation, where loss began. When Hartwell climbed into his cockpit that morning in late May, he carried more than firepower. He carried the hopes of a command searching for an immediate solution and the burden of a design unproven in the unforgiving sky. He would learn, within hours, whether the flying destroyer could change the rhythm of death and survival over Europe. The afternoon sun hung low behind scattered clouds as Hartwell's fortress rolled toward the runway, its engines thundering with a deeper vibration than any B-17 he had flown before. Ground crews stepped back, arms raised, watching the flying destroyer lumber forward under a burden of armor and ammunition that pressed hard into its landing gear. The wheels left the ground only reluctantly. The climb felt slow from the first 100 feet, as if the machine sensed the weight of expectations and fought against it. Once airborne, the aircraft joined the massive formation spreading across the sky in layered boxes. From Hartwell's seat, the view was a mosaic of engines, wings, glinting turrets, and drifting vapor trails. Every mission began with the same uneasy beauty, but this time he felt the difference in the controls. The yoke resisted his touch. The nose hesitated when he trimmed for climb. The aircraft seemed unwilling to rise at the pace of the others, straining as though the sky itself had thickened. Crossing the channel, the formation tightened. The radio crackled with familiar voices counting bearings, calling out changes in altitude, keeping the boxes aligned. The coastline of France appeared through a thin veil of haze. Below, fields and roads disappeared under a rising curtain of flak bursts blooming like black flowers against the pale afternoon light. The bomber stream pressed onward, engines droning in a rhythm that masked the tension, climbing in every gunner's chest. As the formation approached Saint Nazaire, the flak intensified. The sky trembled with shock waves. Hartwell steadied the yoke as fragments rattled against the underside of the fuselage. The bombs fell from the lighter fortresses, turning their silhouettes leaner and quicker the moment their bays emptied. The B-17s climbed almost at once, gaining speed, rising clear of the worst bursts. Hartwell shoved the throttles forward, but the flying destroyer responded with a sluggish climb, its heavy belly refusing to lighten. Within minutes, the separation began. Above and ahead, the formation stretched into a flowing river of steel. The gap between Hartwell's aircraft and the nearest group widened slowly, then steadily. Morrison, the flight engineer, leaned down from the top turret to check the instruments, worry cutting across his voice as he read the fuel consumption numbers. The YB-40 burned more climbing fuel than briefed, its 4 engines laboring under a load that refused to let go. By the time they reached the outbound leg, the main formation was a distant line on the horizon, just visible between drifting clouds. Hartwell kept the throttles forward, careful not to cross into destructive power settings. The third engine ran hot despite his efforts. Morrison adjusted the cowl flaps and tapped the indicator for emphasis. It was climbing into the red. Then the radio operator called from the waist. Contrails. High. Closing fast. 6 enemy fighters descended from the sun in a shallow curve, their wings glinting with the hard metallic flash that every gunner learned to fear. Focke Wulf fighters approached like wolves testing a herd, moving in, banking away, then aligning again, the first dove at 5 o'clock high. The tail gunner called the range, steadying his breathing as he waited for the fighter to grow larger in his sight. At 800 yards, he fired. The shock of the guns pulsed through the tail and into the fuselage. The tracers arced upward toward the diving fighter. The German pilot veered away, choosing survival over the kill. A second fighter followed from 11 o'clock high. This time, the chin turret tracked the target with smooth precision, the twin 50 caliber guns speaking in a long, controlled burst. Smoke trailed from the enemy's cowling. The fighter rolled over and vanished into the clouds below. Inside Hedgehog, hope rose for a moment. The guns worked. The idea worked. Turrets covered every angle. The fortress that could not outrun its escorts could at least fend off the attackers long enough to survive. But the sky was relentless. More fighters circled. 3 made probing runs, only to break off as overlapping fields of fire pushed them away. For 6 long minutes, the YB-40 looked almost invincible, a steel hedgehog bristling with quills. Then the formation ahead accelerated again, pulling away at a pace the heavy aircraft could not match. The gap stretched to miles. The sky thinned, and the hunters returned. A pair of fighters appeared at 2 o'clock, circling in tight arcs as they studied the aircraft's movement. They seemed to recognize the limitations of the machine below. Hartwell felt it too. The flying destroyer could throw out astonishing firepower, but it could not maneuver, could not climb, and could not run. The fighters held their distance, waiting for the moment when the gunship would become truly alone. It came sooner than Hartwell expected. The last faint line of friendly bombers vanished into the distance, swallowed by the afternoon glare. Morrison called out the fuel state again, colder this time. They had burned far more than expected. He calculated the remaining flight time to England and compared it against the engine temperatures. Every choice favored survival but threatened the ability to reach the coast. Then the next attack began. 3 fighters approached at once from different angles: high right, low left, and straight ahead. Hartwell steadied the yoke, knowing any evasive movement would bleed speed they could not afford. His gunners opened fire. Spent brass rolled across the deck. The ball turret swept left. The top turret swung right. The chin turret poured fire straight ahead. The aircraft vibrated under the recoil of 8 guns firing at once. The frontal attacker shuddered and peeled away, smoking. The high fighter broke off without firing. But the low attacker kept coming, closing the distance until its cannons spat bright flashes that walked across the right wing. The impact tore through hydraulic lines. Morrison shouted over the intercom. Fluid sprayed across the waist windows. The landing gear system was hit. The trim tab jammed. The controls grew heavy, unresponsive. Hartwell fought the yoke with both hands. Then the radio crackled again. A second YB-40 was falling behind its formation. Captain Richard Hayes, flying another gunship, had also been left alone. His voice carried strain as he reported an engine losing oil pressure. The 2 heavy escorts formed up in a loose defensive pair, their combined guns sweeping, overlapping paths across the sky. For a moment, their mutual presence discouraged the fighters, but the enemy stayed close, circling like shadows waiting for a falter in speed or direction. Crossing the French coast outbound, the sea appeared as a grey sheet stretching to the horizon. 40 minutes of flight remained. 40 minutes of hope threading through engine temperatures and waning fuel. Both aircraft began losing altitude as their engines strained. Hayes throttled back his failing engine, but the pressure dropped to 0. Soon his Fortress flew on 3 engines alone, sinking slowly through the thinning sky. The next threat came from behind. 2 Messerschmitt fighters dove in from 18,000 feet, cannons firing from long range. The tail gunners returned fire. Though the attacks came from steep angles that tested every gunner's instincts, shells ripped through the tail surfaces of Hartwell's aircraft. One explosion shook the stabilizer. Another burst punched through the fuselage just behind the tail gunner's position. Hartwell felt the aircraft sag on one side, the controls sluggish as he tried to keep the nose level. The German fighters climbed away to reposition for another pass. Hayes responded first, the dorsal guns of his YB-40 opening up in a furious burst that traced glowing lines across the darkening sky. The fighters hesitated. Then something else appeared in the distance. 4 American P-47 fighters swept in from the northeast, descending like hawks toward the attackers. The German pilots saw them coming and broke off immediately, banking hard toward the French coastline. The Thunderbolts did not pursue. Instead, they drew into formation with the 2 faltering gunships, wagging their wings in a wordless promise to escort them home. But the danger was not over. Fuel drained rapidly. Hartwell held the throttles with care, feeling every shudder from the damaged stabilizer. Morrison monitored the remaining time, calculating their chance of reaching land. Hayes fell farther behind, his 3-engine aircraft sinking toward the lower clouds. At last, the chalk cliffs of England rose through the haze. Hayes aimed for the nearest airfield, a broad strip at Manston, and declared an emergency landing. Hartwell watched the other gunship descend, its engines straining, its crew fighting to keep it steady. Moments later, the aircraft disappeared from view behind a row of rolling hills. Hartwell's Fortress reached Alconbury only after he and his co-pilot hand-cranked the landing gear down. Each turn of the handle a battle against damaged hydraulics and failing strength. The wheels locked seconds before touchdown. The aircraft thumped onto the runway, skidding slightly as Hartwell held it steady. When the engines finally shut down, silence filled the cabin like a tide. Ground crews counted bullet holes across the fuselage, bent panels, shredded hydraulic lines, a damaged stabilizer, and a jammed trim system. Every mark told the same story. The gunship had fought hard, and it had survived, but it had fallen behind, exactly as the engineers had feared. Colonel Reed stood waiting at the hardstand. He asked for Hartwell's assessment before the pilot even stepped onto the concrete. Hartwell's flight suit was damp with sweat. His hands shook from the long fight with the controls. He met Reed's eyes and said the words that ended the hope behind the design. It cannot keep up. Yet command insisted on further testing. Perhaps it was only a first mission irregularity. Perhaps positioning the YB-40s in different parts of the formation would solve the issue. Over the next several weeks, the gunships flew missions to different targets: Lammers, the synthetic rubber plant at Huels, and the shipyards at Kiel. Each time, the pattern repeated. The formation dropped its bombs, climbed away, and the flying destroyers sank behind like anchors tied to the wind. Engineers tried quick fixes. They moved ammunition forward to adjust the center of gravity. They modified feed chutes. They altered loading procedures. Nothing changed the outcome. The aircraft remained too heavy, too slow, and too fuel-hungry to stay with the faster, lighter B-17s on the return leg. The data became undeniable. The gunships achieved a handful of victories, but the cost was staggering. Every mission left them alone for long minutes over hostile territory. Every crew risked becoming prey instead of protector. German fighter leaders recognized the pattern immediately. The gunships were easy to identify. They had extra turrets, altered silhouettes, and no bomb bay doors. They were hunted with precision. By late summer, the decision came quietly. The program would end. The remaining aircraft returned to the United States. Some were converted back to standard bombers. Others became trainers. A few were dismantled. The experiment had failed as a concept. But inside that failure, unseen at first, lived the seeds of an innovation that would reshape the air war and save thousands of American lives. Inside a fortress at altitude, sound does not simply fill the space. It presses into bones, into breath, into the thin metal walls that separate sky from men who know they may not see another sunrise. The engines are the first voice, a constant low roar that vibrates through boots and into the floor. Over that thrum come the rattling plates, shifting ammunition boxes, the occasional metallic cry of a turret rotating against its stops. For the crew of a YB-40, every sound carried meaning. Each one a reminder of how fragile a human life could feel inside a machine weighed down with more steel than sense. On Hartwell's aircraft, the man who felt the machine most personally was Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison. He had tended B-17 engines for years, learning the temperament of the Cyclone as if it were a living thing. In the flying destroyer, he understood instantly that the engines were being asked to do more than they were built for. He could hear strain in the rising pitch when Hartwell pushed the throttles forward, feel the shudder that ran through the frame when the aircraft tried to climb but could not. During the long minutes of combat, he moved between gauges with the tight focus of a man trying to keep a wounded creature alive through sheer will. Below him, in the cramped sphere of the ball turret, another kind of willpower battled cold and fear. The ball turret was a lonely place, a suspended world of plexiglass and guns where the horizon spun with every change in direction. The gunner inside had no room to shift his weight, no space to ease the tension in his neck or legs. When the enemy fighters made their first pass, the ball turret gunner swung quickly to his sector, tracking a shadow that grew into a shape, then into a predator lined with cannon flashes. He squeezed the triggers, feeling the turret rock with each burst. Shell casings tumbled inside the turret like brass rain. Through the gun sight, he saw only the blur of speed, a streak of smoke, and the cold knowledge that the fighters would return. At the waist positions, the air was colder still. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney stood with his boots braced wide, gripping the twin 50 caliber guns mounted in the staggered configuration that felt strange but allowed him room to breathe. He could see sky through the empty spaces between the barrels, see the wake of the fortress in the drift of clouds behind them, and see the faint shimmer of other bombers retreating ahead. When he spotted contrails climbing toward them, his voice carried steady over the intercom. Yet his hands tightened around the handles as he watched the specs enlarge. The waist positions were open to the wind, and the slipstream tore at his flight suit. Each time the guns fired, the recoil pushed hard into his arms. He did not flinch. He knew that a fraction of a second lost to hesitation could mark the difference between a warning and a funeral. In the tail sat Staff Sergeant Raymond Kack, a former ski shooting champion whose steady hands had once guided bullets across a peaceful winter landscape. The tail gunner's view was a long tunnel of sky, framed by glass that threw reflections into the corners of his sight. He felt the entire aircraft flex when the German fighters approached from high 6 o'clock. The moment he opened fire, the vibrations of his guns traveled through the tail like a living heartbeat. He watched his tracers drift toward an enemy pilot lunging upward in a desperate climb. For a moment, he thought he had the line. Then cannon shells tore into the stabilizer, and the tail lurched. One explosion punched through the fuselage just behind him. He glanced at the ragged hole, a few inches from where he had been leaning only moments before, and returned to his sight picture without a word. Human courage inside the YB-40 was not a dramatic shout or a heroic pose. It was the quiet discipline of men standing in the wind, fighting to steady their breathing while the sky turned hostile around them. It was Morrison climbing from the top turret to kneel beside an overheating engine, knowing that a single decision could decide whether they reached the coast or fell into the sea. It was Delaney reporting damage in an even tone to keep panic from spreading through the intercom. It was Kack forcing calm into his voice as he tracked the next attack even while the aircraft trembled under his boots. And it was Hartwell, hands locked on the yoke, pulling against a jammed trim system that made every adjustment feel like wrestling a steel animal. When the control surfaces stiffened after being hit, he felt the aircraft resist him with stubborn weight. He leaned his shoulder into the movement, muscles shaking as he tried to hold a straight line, while Morrison calculated fuel that seemed to vanish faster with each passing minute. The wind whistled through torn metal at the rear of the fuselage. The smell of hydraulic fluid drifted into the cockpit. Yet his voice remained steady, giving orders, acknowledging bearings, guiding his crew through the chaos without letting them sense how hard he fought the machine beneath him. On Hayes's aircraft, the strain showed differently. His crew watched the oil stream from the failing engine, each man understanding what it meant for a fortress already struggling. When Hayes throttled the engine back, the aircraft dipped toward the lower clouds. The gunners in his waist and tail positions could see Hartwell's aircraft slipping ahead, its damaged stabilizer wobbling in the sunlight. Hayes knew he had to keep them both in sight, not only for mutual protection, but for the comfort of not dying alone above enemy territory. For both crews, the crossing back toward England felt like an endless stretch of fragile hope. They were miles behind the retreating bomber stream, cut off from the protection of numbers. The German fighters studied them from a distance, their silhouettes dark specks against the pale sky. Everyone understood the danger of falling further behind. Every gunner held his breath, waiting for the next dive. Every man checked his harness twice, tightened gloves, or whispered a quick private thought to someone waiting at home. When the P-47 fighters finally swept across their path, the relief inside both gunships was palpable. Morrison exhaled a breath he had held without realizing it. Delaney slumped against his harness for a moment, letting the wind cool the sweat on his face. Kack wiped frost from his sight window with the back of his glove. Hayes steadied his limping aircraft, grateful that someone else now stood between his crew and the enemy. Hartwell felt the tension ease from his shoulders, though his hands never fully loosened on the yoke. Even after reaching the English coast, the battle was not over. The landing gear on Hartwell's aircraft had to be lowered by hand, a task that demanded strength from men already exhausted. Hayes faced a worse fate, descending toward Manston with 3 engines and a crew preparing for a landing that could break the aircraft apart. Both crews fought fatigue, fear, and the long silence that followed the final burst of gunfire. A silence filled with the weight of knowing how close they had come to being counted among the bomber crews who never returned. Human stories like these rarely appeared in official reports. The paperwork recorded bullet holes, fuel states, malfunctioning gear, and the date of the mission. It did not record the courage of a ball turret gunner firing alone in the cold, or the calm voice of a radio operator calling out contrails that could mean death. It did not record Hartwell's trembling hands or Morrison's stubborn effort to keep the engines alive. It did not capture the way men held onto hope inside a steel shell that refused to outrun danger. The YB-40 program may have failed as a machine, but inside those missions were men who carried their duty with quiet dignity. They bore the weight of a flawed design and turned it into a lesson that others would use to survive. Their fear was real, their courage unspoken. and their humanity the thread that bound every mile of their journey home. From the viewpoint of American commanders, the YB-40 arrived at a crossroads in the air war. The 8th Air Force was under immense pressure to prove that daylight precision bombing could break the industrial backbone of the Axis. Every mission that returned with empty spaces in its formation raised new doubts. Yet within the strategy, there was no alternative. The factories had to be struck. The bomber force had to fly. And until long-range escort fighters were ready, the nation needed something that could fill the widening gap between theory and survival. When the YB-40 entered service, planners hoped it would give the formations a chance to hold together after the bomb drop. Reports from the first missions did not match those hopes, but the American response did not end with disappointment. Instead, engineers and analysts treated the failures as data. Every damaged turret, every jammed feed chute, every overheated engine became a clue. The program was not seen only as a setback. It was a laboratory that happened to fly under fire. The United States had a vast industrial engine capable of absorbing lessons quickly. At Wright Field, officers studied how the chin turret performed under combat conditions. The conclusion was unmistakable. The forward turret had changed the geometry of frontal attacks. German pilots who had once dived confidently through the narrow weakness at 12 o'clock now faced a concentrated burst of fire that made the approach far more dangerous. The chin turret moved from experiment to necessity in a matter of weeks, and within months it became the signature of the B-17G, the definitive fortress. Beyond the turret, the staggered waist gun positions and the Cheyenne tail design showed how incremental improvements could alter a crew's chance of surviving a mission. Better visibility, more space for movement, fewer collisions between gunners in the heat of combat, and improved arcs of fire meant that each fortress flew with a stronger protective shell. These were not dramatic changes in doctrine, yet the cumulative effect reshaped the survivability of entire formations. To America's allies, especially those flying alongside the United States in the European theater, the evolution of the fortress signaled renewed strength. British commanders understood the value of reducing losses in daylight raids, and Allied planners recognized that every aircraft that returned home brought back trained crews who could fly again. As the B-17G spread across the continent, formations became tighter, loss dropped, and confidence grew that the long air war could be sustained. From the German perspective, the shift was unmistakable. Luftwaffe pilots, who once relied on frontal attacks, began to encounter fortresses that bit back with unexpected force. Their commanders noted the change in their own intelligence summaries. The American bombers were learning, adapting, and hardening. The air war became more costly for the defenders as the new fortresses blunted tactics that had once been reliable. In the broader global context, the rise of the B-17G marked a turning point in the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The ability to keep trained crews alive long enough to complete tours meant that the cumulative experience of the air forces deepened with each passing month. What had begun as a desperate attempt to create a gunship evolved into improvements that shaped the final years of the conflict. The world rarely remembers the programs that fail, yet the YB-40 influenced decisions made in hangars, laboratories, briefing rooms, and factory floors across multiple nations. Its flaws forced clarity. Its strengths inspired change. And in the shared struggle of the Allied air forces, those changes helped tip the balance in a battle fought not only with steel and fuel, but with knowledge carried from one mission to the next. By the end of that summer in 1943, the verdict on the YB-40 was no longer a matter of debate. The missions had spoken more clearly than any committee. The concept that had promised protection had instead created vulnerability. The gunship that was meant to shield the formation struggled to remain within it. The weight of its armor and ammunition chained it to the slowest edge of the sky, a place where the enemy waited with practiced precision. Commanders reviewed the reports, ran the numbers, and accepted what Hartwell had said on the tarmac after his first mission. The aircraft could not keep up. Yet the story of the YB-40 did not end in defeat. Failure in war is rarely a simple ending. It is often a doorway, narrow and difficult, that leads toward discoveries no one expected. In laboratories, workshops, and drafting rooms across the United States, engineers sifted through the details of every sortie. They were not searching for excuses. They were searching for answers hidden inside the wreckage of a broken idea. The chin turret stood out immediately. It had changed the dynamic of frontal attacks. German pilots, once confident in the narrow weakness at 12 o'clock, found themselves facing an unmistakable stream of fire that converged with a precision none of the older fortresses possessed. Reports from bombardiers noted how the turret's handling felt natural, how its field of fire eliminated blind spots that had once cost lives. This was no longer an experimental modification. It had become a necessity. Factories across the nation reacted with speed. The Bendix turret entered full production. Boeing integrated it into the design of the B-17G, followed quickly by the staggered waist gun positions and the Cheyenne tail assembly. The result was not simply an improved bomber. It was the most refined version of the flying fortress ever built, shaped not by theory but by the harsh truth of combat. Every line in the blueprint carried the mark of lessons learned from 12 aircraft that failed in almost every way except the ways that mattered most. As these new fortresses arrived in England, crews walked around them with a reverence that came from experience. They touched the cool steel of the chin turret, remembering the stories of attacks broken, of lives saved, of missions that ended not in flames but in safe landings. They entered waist positions with more space to move, more flexibility to track fighters that once slipped through tight angles. They stepped into a tail assembly that offered clearer visibility and stronger protection. Each improvement was a quiet promise that they would have a better chance than the crews who had flown before them. The impact spread far beyond individual missions. Loss rates shifted. Formations held tighter. Veteran crews completed their tours. New pilots survived long enough to become seasoned leaders. In the final years of the air war, the B-17G shaped the rhythm of Allied strategy, allowing deep strikes into targets once considered unreachable. The changes that emerged from the YB-40 program rippled outward through every airfield, every briefing room, and every high-altitude battle over Europe. For Hartwell, the legacy was personal. He returned to Alconbury as a training officer and watched the first B-17Gs roll onto the hardstand. The young crews walked around the aircraft with curiosity and relief, studying the turret that guarded their most vulnerable angle. When they asked where it came from, Hartwell told them the truth. It came from a gunship that could not keep up. It came from a program that lasted barely 3 months. It came from an idea that collapsed under its own weight but left behind something stronger than success. A lesson, a design, a path forward. History often forgets the failures that paved the way for triumphs. The YB-40 left no preserved airframes in museums, no memorials to its missions, no surviving wings gleaming under polished lights. What remains instead is the legacy woven into every B-17G that crossed enemy territory and returned home. The forward turret that lit the sky with tracer fire. The staggered waist guns that gave gunners the space they needed to protect their brothers. The redesigned tail that widened the horizon for men watching the danger approaching from behind. The YB-40 did not win glory. It earned something quieter and deeper. It proved that even a flawed idea could carry the seed of innovation. That failure, when studied with humility and urgency, could save lives. The program ended, but its lessons endured through every mission that followed, through every pilot who reached 25 flights, through every crewman who stepped from a battered fortress onto English soil and breathed the cold night air with gratitude. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe the forgotten chapters of history deserve to be told with honesty and heart, consider subscribing to WW2 Secret Archives. Together, we can keep these memories alive and honor the men whose courage turned failure into a lasting legacy.